Hello everyone, and welcome back to True Crime Guru. I just want to take a moment to thank you all for your continued support and to remind you to please subscribe if you haven't already and turn on notifications. I also ask that you please follow the channel on all social media platforms where I post updates and information on how you can help out with these cases. If you haven't already gathered from the title of today's episode, I will be bringing you a wrongful conviction case today. I would like to bring you more cases like these, but unfortunately, even with as common as they are, wrongful conviction cases are a little hard to come by. You kind of have to go searching for them, and that is just what I was doing when I came across David Yarde's story. David is currently serving time in a Massachusetts correctional facility for a shooting that took place in 2012, which has been scientifically proven impossible for him to have committed. The weekend before Halloween is always a busy weekend, especially in a big city. People are going to bars and costume parties, and I'm sure it's a weekend when first responders and hospitals are expecting a lot of traffic. And I'm sure that this was true in Boston during the early morning hours of October 28th, 2012, when Boston EMS responded to a shooting that took place in the parking lot of the Tremont Street apartment complex. The victim was 22-year-old DeAndre Russ, and he had suffered several gunshot wounds, most noticeably one to the head. There were 4 other young men present at the time of the shooting: Calvin Miranda, Victor Lewis, John Collins, and David Yarde. Just a few hours earlier, they had all been attending a Halloween party in the complex. And usually Halloween parties are pretty fun. But the attendees of this particular party would report that things got a little awkward. You see, DeAndre kept asking everyone at the party where they were from. To some of you, this may not seem like that loaded of a question, but according to David, in the neighborhood that they were in, it meant, quote, to determine if you were their beef or if you were a cool individual, end quote. Nobody seemed to really want any trouble, so when DeAndre kept asking this, it made things really uncomfortable and kind of tense. David would later recall that a friend had come up to him and said that he had just gotten into some sort of altercation with someone who just arrived at the party. Being the good friend that he was, David attempted to de-escalate the situation, and the individual ended up leaving the party. This apparently did not go over well with DeAndre, because David says the next thing he remembers is DeAndre going over to a friend to retrieve a weapon. He had stuck it in his waistband and approached David. He asked David where he was from and, quote, did you have something to do with my man leaving the party, end quote. I'm assuming that he was referring to the individual who had just gotten into it with David's friend. DeAndre getting a gun and becoming more confrontational was the breaking point for David and several other men, Victor Lewis, John Collins, and Calvin Miranda. DeAndre was clearly trying to instigate something, and no one was having it. So they all decided to leave and had boarded the elevator. But DeAndre followed them. While in the elevator, DeAndre stayed persistent in asking everyone where they were from. At this point, everyone, including David, was just like, I'm from nowhere, as a way to get DeAndre to stop and to keep the peace. As they exited the building, it was not lost on everyone that DeAndre was following them with a weapon in his waistband. So they all decided to go towards the right, where there were some concrete pillars to offer protection in case things turned sour. Now, I'm going to play some surveillance footage of what occurred next. The footage is a little hard to follow, but I promise I will provide some more context after it. Like I said, it is a little hard to make out exactly what happened. But what occurred was David and the three others were making their way away from DeAndre when DeAndre had approached David yet again. David would later say that he had lifted up his shirt to prove to DeAndre that he was not packing. And then the next thing he remembered was the shots going off. You may have noticed that the exact moment when these shots were fired and hit DeAndre were not shown in the footage. That is because, as luck would have it, it was that precise moment when the camera changes angle. Everyone then dispersed, with David being the last to run away. The Boston EMS responded almost instantaneously, and they did locate a blank-firing semi-automatic pistol that was modified to fire live rounds in DeAndre's waistband still. So it seemed that his weapon was not the one used. 6 spent shell casings were located to the left of DeAndre's body and close to the street. I know that it seems like I'm being a little overly specific, but I promise all of this becomes very important later on. DeAndre Russ was pronounced brain dead at 9:02 a.m. that morning, and life-sustaining measures would be removed shortly after. When the autopsy was conducted, it was concluded that there had been 3 total gunshot wounds, 1 to each of DeAndre's legs and 1 fatal shot to his head. The shot to the head had entered through the left side of DeAndre's forehead and had exited through the back right side. Now it was up to detectives to determine which of the other 4 men present had inflicted this fatal wound. Luckily for detectives, there had been an impartial witness to the shooting, a man who lived across the street named Delando Hawthorne. Hawthorne stated that the shooter was a slim, brown-skinned man that was about 5'8" and wearing dark clothes with a dark baseball cap. When interviewing Calvin Miranda and Victor Lewis, they both said that they were walking in front of the other 3, and as soon as they heard the shots, they ran and never looked back. When interviewing John Collins, he had initially tried to deny even being at the party, which obviously did not fare too well for him, and he would have to admit that he was, in fact, there. But he would say that he did not know who the shooter was. But according to reporting done by Patricia Tolson for the Epic Times, it would later be discovered that John Collins' interview tape would be paused. And then when it restarted, he was very much indicating that David Yarde was the shooter. I also want to point out that for the most part, all of these men had grown up in this area, except for David Yarde. David was born in Boston, but he had actually grown up in Barbados for most of his life. It's unclear to me on how he ended up back in Boston, but I do know that he was only acquainted with these people. So to me, it's more likely that these guys would cover for someone that they've known their whole lives, as opposed to someone that they've only known for a short while and weren't really tight with, which would make David the perfect scapegoat. And then, according to Detective Kevin Dugan, who says he watched the surveillance footage hundreds of times, he swore up and down that he saw David leaving last with a gun in his hands. Between this and the oh-so-reliable statement given by John Collins, I guess this is all they needed to arrest David Yarde on November 20th, 2012. When they interviewed David, he did say that he remembered attending a costume party that night, but he didn't remember where, and he didn't remember having to use an elevator. Now, I can see how this probably sounded weird to detectives, as there was surveillance footage of David being there, including in the elevator. Also, someone died that night, so that is something that most people would remember being present for. David Yarde was indicted by a grand jury in December of 2012. And strangely, he was also indicted for unlawful possession of a firearm. But the murder weapon was never located, and there was no weapon located that belonged to David either. David Yarde's trial would not begin for about another year and a half on July 23, 2014. The Commonwealth had several people testify, including Detective Kevin Dugan, who doubled down that he, without a doubt, saw David running away from the scene with a gun. John Collins also testified that David was the shooter, despite his initial reluctance to name a shooter and that mysterious pause in his recorded police interview. The pathologist that testified for the Commonwealth said that the shooter would have had to have been at least 3 feet away from DeAndre Russ at the time of the shooting. Strangely, the defense team declined to cross-examine the pathologist. So therefore, the jury only got to hear what the Commonwealth wanted them to hear from her. Another surprising thing in the trial was the witness, Delando Hawthorne, was not called to testify by the prosecution, but by the defense. I'm going to play an excerpt from his recorded pre-trial interview, and you will see why.
Altercation right here. With this dude, I would have remembered that white hat. He wasn't the shooter.
Okay. Yeah.
You see, and you see him backing up?
Yeah.
As he's hiding away from the column?
Well, we're going backwards.
Okay.
So I'll just play it from here.
You see, this dude comes back in white. He went that way. Oh, something's going on, man.
Yeah. So the guy in the white cap ducks around behind the... He's ducking around behind, see?
He goes behind the column, and then it's like they're going back and forth. But I'm telling you, it wasn't that dude in the white hat. The dude had the dark-colored hat and skinny, brown skin.
Okay.
Skinny brown.
As you heard, Hawthorne clearly says that the shooter was not the dude in the white hat, which would have been David. It is rather unusual for a witness like this to be called by the defense and not the prosecution. But it's quite obvious that what Delando Hawthorne had to say would have been damaging to their case. The defense uses this to say that the shooter could not have been David. But other than this, the defense really doesn't do much else. They did not call any experts, and they did not call any other witnesses. which is probably why on August 6, 2014, the jury would find David Yarde guilty of second-degree murder and of unlawful possession of a firearm, even though the prosecution did not provide any actual evidence for the firearm charge. But of course, I'm sure that that was the least of David's worries. On August 22, 2014, David would be sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 15 years, and 3 years for the firearm conviction, to be served concurrently. David Yarde immediately filed his notice for appeal by the deadline in September of 2014. But of course, the appeals process is a very long and excruciating one, and David was going to need some allies on his side. A man named Bobby Constantino was hired for the Suffolk County's District Attorney's Office as Chief of Innovation and Strategy. One of his job duties was to review some cases that defense attorneys wanted a second look at. And that is how he came across David Yarde's case. He immediately started calling for a new trial and is still advocating today. The Innocent Convicts organization also became involved in David's case. They are one of the many organizations in this country working diligently to try and correct wrongful convictions. In 2018, David had obtained new counsel under attorney Jarrett Adams, and they had moved forward to file a motion for a new trial. They filed the motion under the grounds of ineffective assistance of counsel, because David's original defense team did not hire their own experts and had also failed to cross-examine the Commonwealth's pathologist at trial. So, of course, they hired their own experts, starting with Dr. Jonathan Arden, who was board certified in anatomic and forensic pathology and had more than 30 years of experience in this field, including 9 years with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for New York City. Through his analysis of the case, Dr. Arden determined that it was not possible for David Yarde to have shot DeAndre Russ from where he was standing in his last position in the surveillance footage. And a lot of this has to do with where the fatal bullet had entered DeAndre's head. Dr. Arden had noted that spent casings from a pistol are normally ejected to the right of the pistol. And since the casings were found to the left of DeAndre's body, that would mean that the shot would have had to have originated from the left of DeAndre as well. Not to mention that the bullet entered the left side of DeAndre's head. Where David was standing was directly in front of DeAndre, to the right a little bit. So he would not have been able to fire a weapon into the left side of DeAndre's head. Dr. Arden had also determined that the shooter would have had to have been approximately 2 feet away from DeAndre. He said this because there was a presence of stippling to the left side of DeAndre's face. Stippling, which is also called tattooing, occurs when unburnt gunpowder, usually fired from a close range, strikes the skin and causes a superficial injury. Dr. Arden knew from the case files that the pillar separating David and DeAndre was 5 feet deep, so therefore there had to have been at least 5 feet of separation between them. And stippling would not have been present had the shot been fired from that far away. In addition, David's new defense team had gotten a second opinion from another board-certified pathologist named Dr. Elizabeth Lapisada. She had come to a similar conclusion and had written, quote, "It is impossible for the shots to have originated from Mr. Yarde's position. The bullets entered the left side of Mr. Russ's body, and he collapsed to his right. The positions of the ejected casings place the gunfire as originating from the left side of the pillar. and the witness notes the muzzle flashes originating from the left side of the pillar. End quote. Now, it is kind of an unsaid truth that experts will say whatever you're paying them to say when it comes to criminal law. But what these experts are saying makes sense. I honestly don't think you need a PhD to conclude that if a shot enters someone from the left, then it probably originated from the left. At least in this situation anyway. The team had also consulted with a moving media and audio/visual forensic expert named Michael Gourneau. He had analyzed the surveillance footage, and it seems like the only two people that he knew by name labeled in the footage were David Yarde and DeAndre Russ. Everyone else was labeled first person, second person, third person. He had concluded that the person labeled third person would have been in better position and had more time to fire the fatal shot than David. And when I say more time, I mean the literal 1 second that the camera had changed angle when the fatal shot was fired. The third person, in reality, was John Collins. Both Dr. Laposada and Michael Gourneau's reports were included in the motion for a new trial, which was officially filed on February 1st, 2019. And just so you know how long it takes these things to go through the process, it wasn't until almost a year later, on January 1st, 2020, when the judge had rendered his decision. The motion was denied, and the reasoning is a little technical and a bit picky, in my opinion. The judge had denied the motion because, in his opinion, the experts that the team had consulted with were not qualified to make the determination that it was impossible for David to have been the shooter. He says instead they should have consulted with a crime scene reconstructionist who would have been more qualified to make that determination. So basically, they had the experts, but not the right experts. Never mind that what the pathologist determined just logically makes sense. His other reasonings for denying the motion were because the camera had changed the angle just when the fatal shot was fired. He says that David or DeAndre could have moved in the 1 second, making it possible for David to have been the shooter. Which is really frustrating because you could literally make that argument about anyone in the video. He also notes that the 5 feet thing doesn't matter because as long as David's arm was within 2 or 3 feet, then he still could have fired the shot. Like I said, this is really picky and not something that any reasonable, logical person would come up with. But hey, that's the justice system. This was, of course, yet another devastating blow to David, who at this point had already spent 8 years behind bars. But he and those who were advocating for him were not giving up. David hired a new attorney named Gordon Spencer, who helped him file another motion for a new trial in 2021. Again, they were claiming ineffective assistance of counsel, not only in the original trial, but also the attorneys that helped David file his first motion, because they had failed to consult with a crime scene reconstructionist and had also not filed a motion to reconsider after the judge denied the motion. As I was reading the second motion document, one thing that kind of made me chuckle a little bit is they were kind of throwing shade at the judge who denied the first motion. They acknowledged that the last defense team did not hire a crime scene reconstructionist, but also pointed out that neither did the prosecution. which is kind of frustrating because in the original trial, the burden is on the prosecution to prove guilt. And yet now the burden is on the defense team to consult with a crime scene reconstructionist. They also accuse the judge of coming up with his own theory as to what happened, which is kind of true because he kept throwing out all these what-if scenarios, and in my opinion, that is just not his responsibility to do that. His job as the presiding judge is to review the evidence presented and make a determination. If he felt the need to inject his own theory, it's even more baffling to me that he did not grant the motion for a new trial, where a jury would be filling in those kind of blanks, which is their job. So, of course, David's new defense team had consulted with a crime scene reconstructionist named Dr. Lewis Gordon. Not to be confused with the attorney Gordon Spencer. One's first name is Gordon and the other's last name is Gordon. The only reason I say that is because I got kind of confused when I was reading it. Dr. Gordon's report was included in the second motion for a new trial and is referred to as the Gordon Report. Dr. Gordon was asked to make a determination on two things. The first was whether or not David could have possibly been the shooter from his last known position as shown in the surveillance footage. The second was to determine if it was possible for David to have moved in the allotted time frame and still have the opportunity to have shot DeAndre. This is when the time frame of the actual fatal shot being fired is really important. As I've mentioned, this is really just 1 second that is being called into question here. In the frame timestamped at precisely 2:18:02 a.m., DeAndre was standing to the west of the concrete pillar, and David was standing northwest. In the one fateful second that passes, the next frame is timestamped at 2:18:03 a.m. DeAndre falls to the ground, and the shell casings would be located to the east of him. Dr. Gordon points out once again that because the shell casings were found to the east of DeAndre's body, it was impossible for them to have been fired from where David was at the northwest position. And the reason for that is really simple, because there was a concrete barrier between David and where the shell casings were found. Dr. Gordon even visited the scene and determined that it was impossible for the shell casings to have penetrated the pillar and ended up where they were found from David's last position. Because of this, Dr. Gordon was able to determine that it was impossible for David to have been the shooter from his last known position. His second challenge was to determine if it was possible for David to have moved or not. He reconstructed the scene to determine if David could have moved from northwest of the barrier to east of the barrier in the under 1 second that it would have been possible for him to have been the shooter. He tried this using both one-handed and two-handed positions of the gun, and could not make it happen in less than 1 second. I think the final timing was around 1.5 to 1.8 seconds. With this, he was able to determine that it was not possible for David to have moved, and even mentioned that it was more probable that the shooter was someone who was already east of the barrier, i.e. John Collins. In April of 2023, Dr. Gordon testified before a judge that the only possible way that the shell casings would have been found where they were if David had been the shooter is if someone had deliberately moved them, which there really would have been no reason for anyone to have done that. According to an article written in the Boston Globe, during cross-examination, the prosecution suggested that perhaps the casings were kicked in that direction or had rolled or bounced. Dr. Gordon responded, quote, "The cartridge casings don't bounce because of their oblong shape and irregular weight. Even if they had bounced 6 inches, or even a foot for that matter, that still does not place them on the right side of the barrier. They'd essentially have to make a U-turn to do that." End quote. The second motion would be denied. I am unsure of the exact reasoning for the denial, but unfortunately, when it comes to appeals, this is usually how things go, which should not be the case, of course. So where does this case stand today? David Yarde is forced to file and undergo yet another long and drawn-out appeal, which should not be the case, because in 2021, after hearing the testimony from Dr. Gordon, the Assistant District Attorney, Dara Kesselheim, literally said, quote, "David has legitimate claims, and were he to take the correct mechanisms and go to the appeals court, I wouldn't oppose it." End quote. There you have it, folks, straight from the District Attorney's office. David has legitimate claims. And the burden should not be on David to right this wrong. It is the District Attorney's responsibility to say, hey, we messed up and we have to take action to fix it. This is where you guys come in. There are currently 2 petitions out there available to sign to support justice for David Yarde. The first one is on change.org, and it was started in September of 2023. This petition is urging the current Suffolk County DA to vacate David Yarde's conviction. A similar petition is available to sign from the Action Network. Signing these petitions will not cost you anything and will only take a minute of your time. The more signatures that are collected, the more likely the DA's office will take this seriously when it is brought to them. In addition to signing the petitions, please share this video so more people are familiar with David's story. Pressure from the public is what brings justice for these cases. I have seen it time and time again. So if this case pisses you off as much as it does me, I urge you to please take action. Links to both of the petitions are in the episode description, as well as available on all of our social media accounts. David Yarde is going on 12 years incarcerated for a crime that is so blatantly obvious that he did not commit. Over the last 12 years, 4 experts have concluded that it was impossible for David to have been the shooter. But if not David, then who? David's defense has really been pushing the theory that the shooter was actually John Collins, which makes sense considering John's last position in the surveillance footage and the analysis provided by the experts. One thing that I have failed to mention until now is that the same kind of shell casings that were found at the scene were found in the bedroom drawer of John Collins. In addition, Collins was charged with the murder of 22-year-old Joshua Briggs on December 20th, 2017. So clearly, he is capable of murder. The wrong man is in prison for the murder of DeAndre Russ, leaving his family without any true justice. Also, David's son Joshua was only 2 years old when his father was arrested and has been forced to grow up without a father. Joshua is living with both physical and verbal disabilities and needs his dad in his life. So again, I urge you to please sign the petitions and share this video so that this wrong can be righted. If you are interested in reading the legal documents that I used to research this episode, both motions for a new trial are in the episode description, as well as David's profile on the Innocent Convicts website and the Justice for David Yarde Instagram page. I also, of course, don't expect all of you to agree with me, so if you have a differing opinion, please share your reasoning in the comments or on social media because I really would be interested. But of course, I do not condone any kind of hateful commentary, so please be respectful. I am going to close with a September 2023 quote from David Yarde himself. Quote, "I have a son who's going to be 13 years old in October, and I've barely had a chance to watch him grow or be a father to him. I have my family and loved ones who have been supporting me throughout the entire exhausting process, which they shouldn't have had to do. I want to end any more suffering for me and my loved ones, especially since the evidence speaks for itself. With all of this said, my family and I need support from you, Mr. Hayden, from our community, and from those who believe in justice. I respectfully ask you to help end my suffering and set me free." End quote. Thank you everyone for watching, and I really hope you all share this video and sign the petitions to support David Yarde. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I would also really like to know your guys' thoughts on this case, so please follow the channel on all social media platforms and let me know what you think. If you have a case in mind for the channel, please email your suggestion to truecrimeguruchannel@gmail.com or feel free to DM me on social media.